The wrong chord. The wrong chord did not sound like a mistake. Dean Martin knew mistakes. He had built a career on dancing around them, turning forgotten lyrics into jokes, turning missed cues into charm, turning accidents into applause. But this was different. This sound did not wobble or wander the way a human hand sometimes does. It collapsed. It sagged. It carried weight in it, something hollow and broken, as if the piano itself had briefly lost the will to stand upright. The note hung in the air just long enough for Dean's smile to remain in place, while something colder moved through his chest. A quiet instinct older than performance, older than showmanship, older even than fear. He was 3 songs into his Riviera set, bathed in warm stage light, martini glass raised loosely in his hand, the crowd leaning forward in that familiar way they always did when he took the stage. But in the space of one breath, the room changed. He did not turn immediately. He kept singing because that was what he had trained himself to do for 30 years. But his eyes slid back toward the bandstand, and what he saw made the lyric die in his throat even as the melody continued. Walter Briggs was no longer sitting the way a man sits when he plays. He was folded forward, shoulders slumped, spine curved in on itself as if something inside him had suddenly become unbearably heavy. The color had drained from his face so completely that under the stage lights he looked almost gray, like old paper. One hand hovered over the keys, trembling, striking notes without shape or pattern. The other was pressed tight against his chest, fingers dug in as if he were trying to hold something together that was tearing open. Sweat poured from his hairline, running in thin streams down his temples. Dean's mouth kept forming the words to "That's Amore," but the song had already left him. All he could see was Walter's face. All he could hear was that wrong chord echoing again in his mind, not as a musical error, but as an alarm. Most of the audience didn't notice. They were smiling, laughing, some of them singing along, waiting for the familiar piano break that always came in this song, the moment Walter usually claimed the room for himself with a playful, effortless run that made the crowd cheer before Dean even came back in. The band noticed. The drummer's stick slowed. The bassist leaned forward, confusion tightening his jaw. The guitarist half rose from his stool. They had seen Walter tired. They had seen him annoyed. They had seen him nursing a drink too many. They had never seen this. Dean felt something in him snap cleanly out of performance mode. The lyric reached the end of the phrase. He took a step back from the microphone, turning fully now, lifting one hand as he always did to cue Walter's solo. The spotlight shifted. Walter tried to play. His fingers struck the keys, but there was no music in it, only noise, scattered and wrong. His hand slipped. His shoulders shuddered once. His mouth opened as if he were about to speak or breathe or call out. Instead, his body folded forward and his head struck the piano with a heavy, sickening sound that cut through the room like a dropped plate in a silent kitchen. The discordant crash rang out, sharp and unplanned, and then the piano went dead under his weight. For a heartbeat, the entire showroom froze. 1,000 people suspended between assumption and reality. A few laughed uncertainly, thinking this was a piece of Dean's loose, unpredictable humor. Someone clapped once, then stopped. The drummer's sticks hung in the air. The bassist's mouth fell open. Dean Martin did not hesitate. He did not look to the wings. He did not reach for a line. He let the martini glass slip from his fingers. It shattered on the stage. He dropped the microphone, and the dull thud it made when it hit the floor was the sound that finally broke the illusion. Dean was already moving. He crossed the stage in 3 long strides and reached Walter as the pianist began to slide off the bench. Dean caught him under the arms, feeling the sudden, terrifying lightness of a body that was no longer holding itself up. He lowered him to the stage, guiding him down so his head would not strike the floor, kneeling with him as if they were alone in the room. "Someone call an ambulance," Dean said, and the smoothness people paid to hear vanished from his voice. What came out was sharp, urgent, unprotected. The room erupted, chairs scraped, women gasped, men stood. Dean placed his hand on Walter's chest, then his fingers at his neck, searching. He found a pulse, thin and irregular, like something trying to remember its own rhythm. Walter's eyes fluttered, unfocused, his lips moving soundlessly. Dean leaned closer, his forehead almost touching Walter's. "Stay with me," he said quietly, intensely, as if the words were a rope he could throw. "Don't go anywhere, you hear me? You stay right here." The stage manager appeared at the edge of the curtain, pale and helpless. Dean did not look away from Walter. "Where's the ambulance?" he said. "Calling now," the man stammered. Dean lifted his head and scanned the crowd. "Is there a doctor here?" he called. A man in the 3rd row was already on his feet, pushing past knees and handbags. "I'm a cardiologist," he said. Dean pointed to the stage. "Up here, now." The doctor climbed up and dropped to his knees, immediately checking Walter's breathing, his pulse, his pupils. "He's having a heart attack," the man said. "We need to keep him stable." Dean nodded once. Tell me what to do." The doctor blinked, surprised, then began giving instructions, and Dean followed them without hesitation, rolling a jacket under Walter's head, keeping him still, speaking to him constantly, not to entertain, not to soothe an audience, but to hold a man where he was. The room had gone silent. 1,200 people watching Dean Martin kneel on a stage, tuxedo wrinkling hair fallen out of place, one hand steady on another man's shoulder, his entire body angled not toward applause but toward breath. Sirens wailed somewhere outside, distant at first, then closer. When the paramedics arrived, they moved fast and decisively, lifting Walter onto a stretcher, fitting the oxygen mask over his face, working in a tight, practiced rhythm. Dean stood back just long enough to let them do what they needed to do, his hands clenched at his sides, his eyes never leaving Walter's face. As they wheeled him out, Dean took one unconscious step after them, then stopped, as if the stage itself had remembered where he was supposed to stand. He picked up the microphone. It was still on. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, and now his voice was low, almost gentle. "That's Walter Briggs. He's the best piano player I ever worked with. He's on his way to the hospital right now. I'm going to ask you to say a prayer for him. Whatever prayer you know, whatever you believe in, send it his way." People nodded. Some bowed their heads. Some wiped their faces. The band stood behind him, stunned, instruments hanging uselessly in their hands. Dean looked at them, then back at the audience, and made a decision that would ripple far beyond that room, though no one knew it yet. "We're going to finish the show," he said. A murmur swept the room. Dean lifted one hand slightly. "Not because nothing happened," he continued, "but because something did, and because Walter is a professional, and if he could talk right now, he'd tell me not to waste your time." He turned to his band. "Strip it down, we'll do it together." And so, without piano, without rehearsal, without safety net, Dean Martin stood back at the microphone and began to sing, carrying not just a melody, but the weight of a moment that had stripped the room of illusion and left something truer in its place. What no one in that showroom knew was that this was only the beginning, that what had happened on that stage was not only a medical emergency, not only a heroic response, but the first crack in a system that had been quietly breaking men like Walter Briggs for years, and that the man they thought they had come to see for songs and laughter was about to step into a role far larger than entertainer, one that would follow him long after the applause died away. The silence after the applause. When the final note faded and the curtain fell, the applause did not end the way applause usually does. It did not roll back into chatter or scrape of chairs or the familiar restless energy of a crowd preparing to leave. It lingered, heavy and sustained, as if the room itself were reluctant to let go of what it had just witnessed. Dean Martin stood at center stage, his chest rising a little faster than it had any right to after 90 minutes of singing, not from exertion but from the strange, unmoored feeling of having performed, while part of him was racing down the strip inside an ambulance. He bowed once, out of habit more than instinct, and when he finally turned away from the lights, the brightness vanished so suddenly it felt like stepping underwater. The hallway behind the stage smelled faintly of cigarette smoke, perfume, and electrical heat. Someone said something to him, he never remembered what. Someone tried to press a glass into his hand. He waved it away. His jacket was still creased from where he had knelt. His cuffs were smudged with something dark he chose not to examine. All he knew was that Walter was no longer under those lights, no longer within reach of his voice, and the space where his piano should have been was burning in his mind like an afterimage. Dean did not change. He did not sit. He did not let the adrenaline drain out of him. He walked straight to his dressing room phone and dialed the hospital number the stage manager gave him, then hung up before it finished ringing and dialed again, as if repetition could force speed into a world that had suddenly slowed to the rhythm of machines and waiting rooms. The woman on the line told him there was a patient by that name in surgery. She could not give details. He thanked her, hung up, and was already reaching for his coat. The hallway outside the Riviera shimmered with neon and movement, tourists laughing, cabs pulling in, the city doing what it always did, unaware that somewhere nearby a man's heart had tried to tear itself apart. Dean slid into the back of a waiting car, gave the address, and only then, as the doors closed and the engine pulled them forward, did his hands begin to tremble. The hospital at night was a different kind of stage, stripped of glamour, ruled by fluorescent light and the quiet urgency of footsteps that never quite ran. Dean walked in still wearing the clothes people paid to see him in, and more than one nurse looked up too quickly, then slowed, unsure whether they were seeing something real or only the reflection of a television set in their memory. He found Walter's wife in the waiting area near the cardiac wing, seated rigidly between her 3 daughters, her purse clutched to her chest as if it were the last solid thing in a room that would not stop moving. Margaret Briggs had the kind of face that had learned early how to hold worry without letting it collapse her. But tonight it showed everything. When she saw Dean, something in her loosened. She stood, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Then she said his name, and it broke the way names sometimes do when they are carrying too much. He sat beside her close enough that their shoulders touched, close enough that she could feel the steady presence of another person, not the echo of a man being worked on behind swinging doors. He asked how Walter was. She told him the words the doctors had used: critical, massive, uncertain. Each one fell into the space between them and stayed there. He told her Walter was strong. He said it the way people say things when they are trying to build something solid out of sound. She nodded, but her hands would not stop moving, smoothing her skirt, twisting her wedding ring, reaching instinctively for a husband who was not there. When she spoke again, it was not about the surgery. It was about something she had not known. She told him about the chest pains she had only learned of from a nurse, about the weeks of quiet discomfort Walter had carried without a word. The guilt in her voice was not loud. It did not need to be. It sat in every syllable. Dean listened, and as he did, something settled into him that was not fear, not even anger, but a growing clarity that this night had not begun with a wrong chord. It had begun months earlier, in 1,000 small decisions to stay quiet, to push through, to protect a job at the cost of a body. When Margaret finally said what she had been holding back, she did not look at him. She stared at the doors instead. She told him they had no insurance, that the band did not come with it, that they had some savings, not enough for a heart. She did not ask him for anything. She did not need to. The words themselves were enough. Dean stood before she had finished the sentence. He asked where the hospital administrator was. He did not raise his voice. He did not explain. 10 minutes later, a thin man with careful eyes and a clipboard approached them, his expression already defensive in the way administrators learn. Dean told him calmly and without ceremony that every bill connected to Walter Briggs would be sent to him. All of them. Surgery, recovery, aftercare, best doctors, best room. There was a brief exchange, a soft attempt at caution, at context, at procedure. Dean cut through it with a quiet finality that did not invite discussion. When the man left, Margaret tried to protest. Dean sat back down beside her and said, not unkindly, that this was not charity, that this was what should have been there in the first place, that no man should have to decide between a doctor and a paycheck. The words surprised even him as he said them, not because he had never believed them, but because he had never been forced to articulate them with such clarity. Walter came through the surgery alive. The doctors told them it had been close. That minutes had mattered. That chance had played its part. Dean stayed until he was allowed to see him, unconscious, pale, threaded with tubes and quiet machines. He did not speak long. He did not need to. He took Walter's hand, felt its warmth, and something in him made a promise that had very little to do with survival and everything to do with what came after. In the days that followed, Dean did not return to the Riviera stage. He went to the hospital. He brought food Margaret did not remember ordering. He sat with the girls and listened to them talk about school, about things that had nothing to do with heart monitors. He read magazines he did not care about. He learned the rhythms of the ward. He watched other musicians visit, men who laughed loudly and then went quiet at the bedside, men who suddenly saw themselves in the man under the blankets. What he could not ignore and what began to take shape more clearly with every visit was how ordinary this crisis was. How many of the men he knew were one bad night away from the same room, the same fear, the same thin layer of financial uncertainty laid over physical terror. He spoke to his manager, then to his lawyer, then to his business advisor. He did not couch it in abstractions. He told them what he had seen. He told them what he intended to change. They cautioned him about contracts, about precedent, about how hotels operated, about what was standard. Dean listened. Then he said that standards were not laws of nature. They were habits, and habits could be broken. 3 days after Walter collapsed, Dean Martin walked back into the Riviera, not as a performer, but as a man who had decided something fundamental was no longer acceptable. The meeting room he entered was comfortable, paneled, designed to make conversations feel smaller than the numbers they dealt in. The men around the table spoke in terms of feasibility and structure. Dean spoke in terms of people. He told them that every musician who worked under his name would have health coverage. He told them it would be written into his contract. He told them that without it there would be no more shows. The room shifted. He could feel it. This was not how these discussions usually went. He was supposed to negotiate percentages, scheduling, billing, not systems, not responsibility. When resistance came, it came carefully wrapped in industry language. Dean let them finish. Then he told them he was willing to walk, and that he would not walk quietly. What happened next would not make headlines for another few days. But in that room, in that hour, something was already changing. Because for the first time, the value of a man's heart was being placed alongside the value of a man's draw. And Dean Martin, who had spent his life being paid to make things look easy, was making it very clear that some things were not easy and were not supposed to be. And somewhere down the hall, behind doors that opened only when they were ready, Walter Briggs was learning how to breathe again. The ultimatum. The meeting room at the Riviera was designed to soften confrontation. Thick carpets swallowed the sound of footsteps. The chairs were upholstered in a fabric that seemed engineered to absorb tension. Even the walls, paneled in warm wood, suggested tradition, stability, and the comforting illusion that whatever happened inside them would remain reasonable. Dean Martin had negotiated in rooms like this for most of his adult life. Money lived here. Contracts lived here. Careers were nudged, shaped, and quietly traded across tables polished to a mirror finish. What did not usually live here was the raw memory of a man collapsing at your feet, or the sound of his skull striking a piano, or the sight of oxygen being forced into lungs that had almost decided they were done. Dean carried those things in with him anyway, invisible, heavy, and entirely unmoved by the comfort of the space. The Riviera's general manager sat across from him, flanked by legal counsel and a business officer whose job was to translate human beings into budget lines. They spoke first, as people often do when they believe they are still setting the tone. They expressed relief at Walter's survival. They praised Dean's professionalism during the incident. They talked about the unfortunate nature of medical emergencies, about how unpredictable life could be, about how grateful everyone was that the show had been able to continue. Dean listened. He had learned long ago that letting people talk told you more than interrupting them ever could. When they finished, he placed both hands flat on the table, feeling the coolness of the wood under his palms, grounding himself not in authority, but in intention. He told them he was amending his contract. He said it simply, without build-up, without rhetorical flourish. Every full-time musician working under his residency would receive comprehensive health insurance, hospital care, preventive care, coverage that meant no one in his band would ever again have to hide chest pain in a bathroom because they were afraid of being replaced. He said he did not care whether the coverage came from the hotel directly or through a third-party plan. He did not care how it was structured. He cared only that it existed, and that it existed immediately. The response was not outrage. Outrage would have at least been honest. What came instead was a slow tightening of language, a careful deployment of precedent. They spoke of how musicians were classified, of how independent contracts functioned, of how opening this door would create expectations that might ripple outward, of cost projections and administrative burdens. Dean heard all of it, and in each phrase he heard the same thing he had heard in Margaret Briggs's voice in the waiting room: not cruelty. Not even indifference, but a system so accustomed to its own shape that it could no longer see the people moving inside it. He let them finish again. Then he told them that he would not perform another show under the existing terms. He said that if they refused, he would walk, that he would void the remaining years of his residency, that he would take his show elsewhere, and that he would not be discreet about why. The temperature in the room changed. It always does when money realizes it is no longer the only thing being negotiated. The general manager's posture shifted. The legal counsel leaned forward. The business officer frowned at figures on a notepad, as if they might rearrange themselves into something more cooperative. They tried reason next. They spoke of the size of his contract, of the commitment already made, of how valued he was, of how such matters were better addressed industry-wide, through unions, through long processes, through committees that moved slowly enough to make urgency theoretical. Dean listened, then said something none of them had prepared for. He told them that Walter Briggs had almost died because he was afraid to see a doctor. He told them that fear had not come from nowhere. It had come from the unspoken knowledge that illness made a man replaceable. That weakness made him expensive. That asking for help made him inconvenient. He told them that if a system required men to gamble their lives in order to keep their jobs, then that system did not deserve the protection of tradition. When the general manager finally spoke again, his voice had lost some of its polish. He said the hotel would need time. Dean said time was what Walter had nearly run out of. He said he would give them 72 hours, not to study the concept, not to explore the possibility, but to implement it. He stood. The meeting was over. Word did not travel slowly in Las Vegas. It did not wait for press releases. It moved through dressing rooms and green rooms, through lounges and loading docks, through the small ecosystems that grew up wherever musicians gathered between sets. By that evening, players at other hotels were already talking about what had happened, about the ultimatum, about the fact that someone with real leverage had finally pointed it somewhere other than his own paycheck. Some were skeptical. They had seen stars make noise before. They had seen concessions promised and then quietly diluted. Others were careful not to hope too loudly. Hope had a way of making disappointment heavier. But they talked, and the talking itself began to matter. Inside the Riviera, the conversation continued, now stripped of pleasantries. Accountants ran numbers that did not appear on stage. Lawyers examined definitions they had never been asked to question. Executives called their counterparts at other properties, careful at first, then less so, as it became clear that this was not a problem that would stay politely contained. Dean, for his part, did not give interviews. He did not perform. He went to the hospital. He sat beside Walter's bed as the pianist drifted in and out of consciousness, his body exhausted by the work of survival. He spoke to him about small things, about records he had loved, about arrangements he used to argue over, about the way he always knew which song to start with on a rough night. Walter smiled faintly when he could. Once, when he was stronger, he whispered that he was sorry. Dean told him not to finish the sentence. On the third day, a call came to Dean's room. The Riviera had agreed, not in principle, not pending review, agreed, comprehensive health coverage for full-time musicians, effective immediately. The language would be finalized, the mechanisms established, the policy announced. But the decision had been made. Dean did not celebrate. He thanked the man on the line. He hung up. He sat on the edge of the bed for a long moment, hands resting on his knees, breathing slowly, as if he were absorbing the fact that something invisible had finally shifted its weight. The announcement came the next morning. It was brief. It was careful. It framed the new policy as a progressive step, a commitment to the well-being of performers. Trade papers picked it up within hours, then larger outlets. The story was not about a clause in a contract. It was about a collapse on stage, about a star who had dropped his microphone, about a pianist who had lived. Other hotels watched closely. They waited for signs of backlash, of financial panic, of shareholder unrest. None came. The Riviera continued to fill its showroom. The lights continued to burn. The numbers continued to make sense. Within weeks, conversations that had never advanced beyond complaint began to change tone. If one property could do it, others could too. If one headliner could demand it, others might follow. Union representatives, who had spent years pressing on doors that opened only a few inches at a time, suddenly found them easier to move. Proposals were reintroduced. Negotiations resumed with a different energy. What had once been hypothetical became precedent. And precedent, in an industry built on repetition, was power. Walter Briggs left the intensive ward before the end of the month. He did not walk out to applause. He walked out slowly, supported on either side, thinner, quieter, alive. Dean was there, so was Margaret, so were their daughters. A nurse wheeled a small oxygen tank behind them, its soft hiss marking time. At the doors, Walter stopped. He looked at Dean for a long moment, his eyes clearer now, carrying something that had not been there before. He said, "Thank you." Dean shook his head, not dismissing the gratitude, but redirecting it somewhere else. He told him to get better. He told him to learn how to be bored. He told him there were worse things than missing a few shows. What no one could yet see was how far the echo of that night would travel. How many negotiations would quietly reference it? How many young musicians would grow up assuming something their predecessors had never been given? How many men would walk into clinics instead of bathrooms when their chests tightened, because the fear that had kept Walter silent had finally begun to loosen its grip? Dean Martin returned to the Riviera stage weeks later. The piano was back, not Walter's hands, not yet, but a place had been left for him. The audience applauded longer than usual when Dean walked out. He acknowledged it with a nod, nothing more. Then he looked to the band, to the empty bench, and began. And somewhere in the room, in the fine, invisible architecture of what people expect from the men who lead them, something had already changed. The quiet things that remain. Time did not return Walter Briggs to the man he had been before that night. It gave him something different. The months after his heart attack unfolded slowly, not in dramatic leaps, but in small, careful increments measured by hallway walks, breathing exercises, and the steady relearning of what it meant to trust his own body. The piano did not disappear from his life, but it moved to the edges of it, no longer the engine driving every day, no longer the altar at which he sacrificed sleep, meals, and silence. Dean visited often, never announced, sometimes staying only long enough to sit and listen while Walter talked about records he wanted to hear again or arrangements he might someday write. Other times he stayed for hours, reading magazines aloud, teasing Margaret, pretending the hospital room was just another green room and they were killing time before a set. What Walter did not say, but what lived in every glance toward his daughters and every careful breath he took before standing, was that survival had rearranged his sense of importance. He had spent decades measuring himself by reliability, by never being the reason a show stopped. Now he was learning to measure himself by something quieter and far more difficult, by presence. The doctors were honest. Live performance with its late nights and adrenaline swings was no longer safe. Walter absorbed this without protest. The stage had almost taken his life. He did not need it back. What he needed was work that did not demand his heart pretend to be something it was not. Dean made the calls. Studio managers, producers, arrangers who owed him favors or simply trusted his judgment began to reach out. Within weeks, Walter had offers, session work, teaching, consulting on arrangements, work that kept his hands on the keys without placing his chest in the line of fire. He moved back to Lowe's Angels. He built a small routine. He recorded. He coached younger players who had never known a world without the protections now quietly spreading through their contracts. He grew stronger. He never again hid pain in a bathroom. The change Dean had forced into the Riviera did not remain contained. Hotels that had waited to see if the sky would fall saw instead that the rooms were still full, that the acts were still profitable, that musicians who felt less disposable played with a different kind of focus. Policies shifted. Benefits appeared. Unions gained leverage where before they had been granted only meetings. Story of the pianist who collapsed and the singer who refused to move on circulated in different versions. Some exaggerated, some simplified, all carrying the same core truth. Something had been confronted, and it had moved. Many of the men and women who benefited from those changes never knew Walter's name. They never saw the wrinkled tuxedo, the broken glass on the stage, the cardiologist climbing over knees. They simply lived in a world that had been made slightly less cruel without their permission. That is often how the most durable changes arrive. Dean Martin did not build monuments to what he had done. He did not mention it on stage. When interviewers asked, he deflected. He talked about Walter as a friend, not a cause, about professionalism, not power. But those closest to him noticed something settle into the way he worked, a different attentiveness, a different patience. He asked after people's families. He insisted on breaks. He backed musicians who asked for time. He used the leverage his name provided not to expand his image, but to narrow the distance between those who stood under the lights and those who made the lights possible. Years later, long after the Riviera Nights had become stories, and the contracts that followed them had been revised and revised again, Walter Briggs stood in a quiet church on a Sunday morning and played hymns on an upright piano that was never quite in tune. His hands were slower now. His hair was thin and white. His daughters sat together in the front pew, their own children restless beside them. He played carefully, not to impress, not to anchor a show, but to fill a room with something that held. After the service, people shook his hand and thanked him. Most did not know who he had once played for. They knew only that he played gently, as if every note were a gift he had not expected to still be giving. Once a year on the anniversary of the night that split his life in two, Walter called Dean. The conversation never changed much. Walter thanked him. Dean told him to stop. Walter laughed. Dean asked what he was working on. Walter described a student, a piece, a small project that pleased him. They spoke about families, about the strange speed of time, about how odd it was to remember rooms that once seemed permanent. When Dean's voice began to carry the softer edges of age, Walter heard it. When Walter's breathing slowed, Dean noticed. They did not need to say what they both understood, that there are nights which do not end when the curtain falls, that some moments remain, quietly instructing everything that follows. When Dean Martin died, Walter was among those who stood in the long, slow line of people who had come to say goodbye. He was older than Dean now, walking with care, his daughters beside him. A reporter recognized him and asked, gently, what Dean had meant to him. Walter did not answer immediately. He looked instead at the closed doors, at the flowers, at the accumulation of a public life that had touched far more private ones than anyone could count. Then he said that Dean Martin had saved his life twice. Once when he pulled him back from a piano and put breath between him and the dark, and once when he made it possible for men like him to ask for help without believing it would cost them everything else. He said that because of that, he had watched his daughters grow into women. He had walked them down aisles. He had held grandchildren. He had lived years he had not earned by any measure, except the accident of being seen by someone who refused to look away. The legacy of that night was not written in plaques or headlines. It lived in waiting rooms that did not empty bank accounts, in musicians who went home after shows instead of pushing through pain, in contracts that assumed care instead of exception. It lived in the quiet relief of men who no longer had to be invincible in order to be employed. Dean Martin had gone on stage to sing. He had walked off having interrupted a story that did not need to end the way it had been written. He had understood, in the space of a single wrong chord, that professionalism was not endurance. It was responsibility, and that sometimes the most important performance a man ever gives is the one in which he refuses to play.